Welcome to Right on Track, a songwriting podcast. Thanks to Tone for tuning in. I'm Demi Michelle Schwartz, and I'm thrilled you're joining me on my songwriting journey. So kick back and relax, don't fall flat, and remember, stay right on track. Welcome back to Right on Track. I am so excited to have a conversation all about the music production process today, and joining me is a very special guest who has recorded me for about 3.5 years now, and now, plot twist, I'm recording him. Please welcome my producer, Bob McCutcheon. Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, it's about time.
I love that you're recording me.
Awesome. Well, I'm delighted you're joining me. We are going to have a fantastic chat today. But before we dive into everything, can you share with the listeners a little about yourself, how you got started in the music industry and ended up opening the vault?
Sure. Yeah, it's a bit of a long and winding road. I've been involved with music my whole life, and back through high school and college. I had played in bands and performed and toured and wrote music and recorded my own music, and eventually started recording my other friends and started my first recording studio. Actually, worked my way through college, running my first recording studio. So I've always done it. Um, Sort of sidetracked myself for 25, almost 30 years. Um, After I graduated from business school, had a long career in public accounting and consulting, but I always kept music in the background. I kept every piece of equipment I've ever purchased. Still had all my guitars, and still, did things at home. And then as my kids got a little bit older, they started to express interest in music, and so it started all coming back again. And then fast forward to about 2015. I literally was watching the Sound City documentary. So if you're not familiar, that documentary was Dave Grohl from Nirvana had done this documentary about Sound City, which was the recording studio where Smells Like Teen Spirit was recorded. And he basically did this documentary that was about the studio that, quote unquote, changed his life. And that studio has an amazing history going all the way back to Fleetwood Mac, actually Buckingham Nicks to Fleetwood Mac and Tom Petty, and just an endless number of projects that came out of there. And I saw this documentary, and it just all came flooding back that my dream was always to have my own recording studio. And so I started down the process of designing it, hired an architect out of LA, found the real estate about less than 10 minutes from my home, which was an old bank building on Neville Island. And we proceeded to build the vault. So thus the name. It's an old bank, and literally the vault is in the basement. We use it as a reverb chamber. Yeah, it's just been it's been a whirlwind, right? So it started off as my own personal project studio, and then Jimmy Hoyson, who's now our chief engineer, had come back from LA. He's a Pittsburgh native, but was out in LA for 30 some years. Had moved back here. He joined us as chief engineer. We put in this amazing Neve console that was originally owned by George Harrison of the Beatles. He sold it to Scott Litt, who was the producer for REM and the Replacements and a bunch of folks. And then we put it in here at the studio in 2018. So it all started to snowball from there.
Well, the vault's the best place to record, so I'm so thankful I get to record there.
We love having you here.
Fantastic. Well, let's shift gears and dive into our quote for this episode, which is by Scott Borchetta. So can you read that?
Sure. So the reality of recording, it's one of the most intimate things that an artist ever does, because if you do it right, you're exposing yourself and you're expressing your emotions. And those are the key attributes to a big record that really connects with people.
I love this. So what's coming to your mind as you're reading that?
Yeah, I believe every word that he says in this quote. I truly believe that the most impactful music is music that's authentic, that is the expression of the artist's emotions, right? And at the end of the day, music is the one of the most expressive forms of art that can communicate things beyond words. But in order for that to really communicate and touch other people, it's got to be authentic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really connect with this quote as well because I think that when you're looking at the whole life of a song from when it's being written to when it's being recorded, I think you really need to give a great deal of thought to every aspect of that because you can have a great song, but if it's produced in a way that doesn't capture the emotion or the message in the best way it can, some of that authenticity can be lost. And so I think that focusing on capturing the emotion and the authenticity and the expression that the artist is trying to convey in the best way in order to communicate that to the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably one of the toughest things as a producer. And there's a lot of different schools of thought and approaches to production. Even when I think about the term producer, it's taken on so many definitions, different definitions over decades, right? But certainly the way I like to approach production is, to your point, making sure that my job, as I see it, is to do the best I can to interpret what the artist feels, hears in their head, and try to ultimately deliver the best representation of what they envision for that music, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And and there are some producers who take a more direct approach to the production of the music. It's the producer's vision for the music, and the artist will sing on top of that track that's been truly produced by the producer. I tend to like to help encourage the artist to come up with their ideas, their vision, and hopefully I can interpret that and deliver what they see in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you have that collaborative approach, you just end up with a better overall product because when we work together, I come in with ideas, but I'm also open to your ideas. And then Luke and Sophia, when they're involved. And I think it's incredible seeing everyone's ideas come together because you capture that emotion and the message of the song and everything from all of us. And I think that's super special.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, if you step back and kind of remember that, the origins of music, it's human interaction, right? I mean, it's music is communication. It's communication not only of the song to the listener, but it's communication between the musicians themselves, right? It's a conversation, a musical conversation. And so it's all human interaction. And so when we talk about collaboration, we're talking about, those individual musicians just simply having a conversation with one another and expressing their views.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So let's dive into the music production process. Obviously, the first stage that can often be overlooked is the songwriting. You can't record a song unless it's written. But in my case, I write all of my songs. And looking at this stage, it's basically just the very bare bones of the song, the lyrics, the melody, the chord progression, the key, tempo, everything that you need in order to create what I like to do is a very stripped demo before I record. So you and my musicians know what the song sounds like and can start to fill in the gaps. And in this early stage, even though I may have some production ideas, I always like to kind of keep things very stripped back in order to allow for that collaboration that we discussed. So, from your point of view, in my situation, I have these songs already written, but what's your perspective of when you're working with an artist that you actually take part in some of the songwriting with?
Yeah, it's interesting. Every project sort of has its own unique evolution, right? Like as you described, right? When you come in to the studio and we start working together, you've got a pretty clear vision for the song as written, right? You've worked out the whole chord progression, the form of the song, you've got all your lyrics written, you've got the melody lines. You often have um, at least some of the backing vocals and harmonies worked out in your head. But there are a lot of projects where we're starting with a songwriter who literally has written lyrics and a melody line, and we're starting, building that song from block chords, right? And just trying to make sure that we ultimately build a music bed that has the right groove and the right feel and represents, stylistically represents what that artist is looking for, which is a really unique challenge when you start with just a melody line, right? Because that can go so many different directions musically. And so to understand what some of the influences might be from that artist, and the direction that they might want to take that song, um, because you're starting from a clean piece of paper. Um, it's really, really important to get on the same page with the artist in terms of what their vision is, and try to interpret that.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned specifically with the melody and going many different directions because when I'm doing my chord progressions, I'm paying a lot of attention to what's the emotion of the song and choosing chords that fit that. You know, if it's a sad, melancholy song, maybe more minor chords, throwing in some embellished chords like seventh chords or suspended chords. So I think that every aspect from the song from that early stage, if you have a strong melody and you have strong chords, then when you start going to the next part with the arrangement, then everything will kind of flow together more nicely because you have that foundation.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's interesting, when you think about just the chord progressions themselves, right? I was thinking about just choice of key and tempo alone are often overlooked,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
But when you start working on a project, you have to very early on, along with obviously the chord progression, is understand your key and your tempo and the feel that you want for that song. Because I have a lot of artists that'll come in, and they often will try to demo that song at the wrong tempo altogether,
Yeah.
and they have an envision of some produced version of that song at the end, but the tempo's twice the speed in which they demoed it, because you're never going to get that upbeat feel from a slow tempo demo, right? And
Mhm.
getting an artist to understand the importance of choosing the right key, the right tempo, and the right key also in terms of just their vocal range.
Mhm.
Making sure they're not writing outside of their range.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just gonna go there. Yeah, that's something that I've been more aware of because when I started recording, there were some parts of my songs that were like hard for me, and then it's like I wrote this song. Why didn't I pick a better key for it? But no, I completely agree, 100%. So let's shift gears and talk more about the whole arrangement side of things. And so that's something that I do partly with the structure and knowing like, okay, verse, chorus, bridge. So that's one part of the arrangement, but a big part that I love working on with you is picking the instrumentation and kind of building that from the ground up. So what are some of the things you keep in mind when doing the arrangement?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Well, first, as you well know, I hate bridges. So, no, but I mean, and that's obviously our joke, right?
Yeah.
Because there's not a song that in our minds, at least, 'cause I know you and I agree on this, that it's not a song unless it has a bridge. Um, but that aside, yeah, I think the instrumentation is critically important, right? Because again, it gets back to let's just start with the genre of the song, right? um, and the feel. And I think a lot of the emotion that goes into the arrangement of the song has a lot to do with the choice in instrumentation. Do I want it to be soft, airy, ambient? Do I want it to be hard and driving? All of those different things are going to influence the instruments that you choose.
Mhm. Yeah. And like from the artist's point of view, reference tracks are extremely important. Like every single time I do a song, I say, this is the artist I'm kind of hearing, and this is a song or two that I'm kind of hearing maybe this bass line, maybe this percussion, this vibe. And because you can't read my mind, well, it feels like you can't half the time. But it's easier for you, I'm sure, to kind of get the vision if you have a song to kind of use as a reference.
Absolutely. I think reference tracks are critically important, and in many aspects of the process, right? Because it's perfectly fine. Every artist in the history of the world, other than the very first, has had an influence, right? So we all have our influences, and individual songs can have their influences, right? Um, but to your point, communicating the abstract, right? A sound that you have in your head, and you're going to try to communicate that sound to me so that I can understand how to translate that. One of the easiest ways to communicate that is through references. That doesn't mean that we're trying to make the song sound exactly like the reference. We're not trying to copy that song, but it's a way of communicating. I like this sound. I like this feel. I like this one part. I like how the vocal was processed in this particular song, right? Using those references is the easiest way to very quickly communicate something that's otherwise very abstract. And it's also helpful later in the post-production mixing process when you get to, how do you want it mixed? What are the sounds that you like? Having those reference tracks even later as points of reference for the mix, again, to try to achieve a sound that the artist is looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a perfect transition into tracking because once we have the arrangement and all of that, we dive into actually recording the tracks. So, from the producer point of view, what is your approach to tracking?
Yeah, it's interesting because the roles within in the recording studio can vary considerably, right? So you have what I would call the individual roles. You have the assistant engineer and the producer, and you'd have the artist and the songwriter. They can at times be all different individuals, but often you have people who are wearing multiple hats. So, like in your case, right, you are the songwriter and the performer artist, right? But sometimes the artist is different than the songwriter. So there's a form of communication that happens between the songwriter and the artist, right, in that process. And similarly, on the production side, the engineer and the producer could be two different people or one and the same, right? Um, so when you and I are working together, I'm acting as both engineer and producer. And so I'm handling the technical side of the recording, the choice of microphones and mic placement, and actually working the console and running, in our case, the Pro Tools rig when we're recording. So I'm doing all of that real time while we're working on the song. And when we're doing things one on one and we're sort of building tracks together, and as you know, a lot of times we'll have a keyboard sitting here and we'll be programming sounds as we go. And at other times we may have live instruments, guitar, bass, drums, um, and so I have to be flexible enough to know whether I'm going to be programming and sitting with a MIDI keyboard, or am I going to be tracking out a band and I'm going to have 20 microphones up at one time. And I've got to, really dig into the console. Every day is something different.
Yeah, absolutely. So that actually leads to something I wanted to ask you about, which is what are the pros and cons of recording digital instruments versus live?
Everything has its place, right? And I think what I'm finding more and more today is when you listen to popular music in particular, it's actually a hybrid of both. You'd be hard pressed to find, quote unquote, top 40 music at least, um, that doesn't have some mix of live instruments and programmed instruments. Um, they have their advantages and their disadvantages. The advantage, maybe in its simplest form, the advantage to live performers is it has that human feel, right? Again, it's an expression of emotion, and human beings are best to express that emotion. And so there's something about live instruments that allow you to do that and to capture that feeling. The advantage to digital is the endless opportunity for selection of instruments and sounds and the sound design that can take place through all the virtual instrument libraries that are available, and the way that you can digitally manipulate sounds. That's wholly creative in its own right. The sound design part of this is a very creative process in itself. Um, so I think there's something to be said for the hybrid combination of both the live performance supplemented with the digital information. And even when, like for instance, when you and I are doing a lot of work together, we're still recording, even though we're digitally recording things.
Mhm.
You're playing the piano, you're
Yeah.
playing the keys, right?
Yeah.
So it's still got that human feel to it because you're actually playing the keyboard,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
But there are other things like when we're programming, percussion instruments and drums and things like that, that, if we're not careful and don't take the time, can sound very mechanical if you don't take the time to think about the nuances, the little ghost notes and the accents and the velocities of how things are being played to make it feel a little bit more human.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Super interesting. So, I think one of the most fun parts is when we're doing the tracking and we're adding all these instruments. It's always really fun to not only see that song come to life as the songwriter, but also kind of like listen back a couple times and see where we can add things, because I think that the most important thing, or one of the most important things with an arrangement and tracking all of these instruments, is making sure there's a build up and there's places that pull back a little bit, and that there's not a whole lot of space where it's not good to have. So I think working together and seeing where we can add things and where we can have stronger impactful moments is super fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, and it gets back to, well, there's certainly an element of spontaneity to the creation of music. Sometimes the most magical moments are those things that you didn't expect and didn't plan, right? But planning and understanding the path that you want to take with the song, the arc of that song, right? How do you want the energy to build? Where do you want it to build to? Where do you want that climax in terms of the energy and the arc of the song? So that, as you're building the arrangement, you're thinking about either building or pulling back in terms of the energy. And that will then dictate whether you're adding instruments and layers to the production or you're pulling things out. And, as you and I spend a lot of time talking about, the transitions
Mhm.
are
Mhm.
hugely important as
Yeah.
well. How do I get from the end of the bridge into the out chorus and have that impact that you're looking for? That transition moment is really important. And what do you do with that? And how do you make that feel the way you want it to feel?
Mhm.
Those are all things that you have to sort of plan and have some vision for up front.
Yeah, absolutely. So once we have a pretty solid instrumental track for the background, I usually sing vocals, and then if we need to add things, we do that afterward, fill in space. But after we do all that and have fun studio days, then it's kind of all up to you with the mixing. So, can you share a little about your process when it comes to mixing?
Sure. I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time, and usually you and I will comp vocals when we're together, right? But what people don't often realize is that when we record, and not just vocals, but a lot of the instrument parts as well, we'll record many, 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 many versions of that. Um, and those versions can either be what we call comped, which is we take the best parts of each of the takes to try to come up with, a comped version of that. That sounds like one take, but it's actually coming from many different takes. It's sort of the best of, right? But the other thing that we do is we do a lot of layering. And I think vocals are a great example of that, where you may have multiple layers of the lead vocal to make that feel bigger and wider. And certainly the backing vocals often have many, many layers to them as well. So when you get into the mixing process, the first thing you have to do is understand what all of those parts are and what role they're going to play in the arrangement and their order of importance, so to speak, right? Some things are meant to be very subtle, sort of in the background, little ear candy, bits of production, and other things are intended to be, out front, the obvious things like the lead vocal, right? Um, but there may be counter melodies and other things that are going on in that arrangement that you want to make sure they're heard at the right times in the right moments in that song. So a lot of the mixing is finding the right balance of all of the instruments and the vocals and everything that's in that arrangement, finding the right balance, but also allowing everything to be heard in that mix and in the moments where they're meant to be heard the most, right? And so that means that things are stepping out, things are stepping back, but we also have a limited amount of real estate to work in terms of the stereo field and the frequency range and the depth of the song. You have to be able to find a place where everything can be heard and still be in balance with the rest of the arrangement. And that's really what the mixing process is in a nutshell.
That's super interesting. So I'm interested in like when you start, do you do like the vocal tuning stuff first and get that out of the way, or do you kind of go to the background instruments, or does it depend on the song?
Yeah, I usually start with, like tuning and timing and what I would call sort of session maintenance, right? Just getting all of the tracks um, in a position where I can start to really do the mix, right? So a lot of the editing work happens up front, and that's literally going through all of the tracks and cleaning out little noises and things. A lot of times there's a performance and we may run a mic from the top, top to bottom on that song, but the instrumentalist is not necessarily playing a note everywhere in the song, right? So there are places where they're sitting there and there's little noises or shuffling in their chair or breaths and all sorts of things that they're there. You captured them, but you don't necessarily want them in the song, right? And so you have to go through all those tracks and you have to clean the tracks. And there's times when maybe there's little timing issues that you want to fix. Tuning and tuning, by the way, is not just vocals. We often tune other instruments as well. But with today's technology, and even the average listener listening to the radio has become so accustomed to hearing perfectly tuned and perfectly timed music, right? That's just because the technology allows that to happen. But as a result of the listener being so accustomed to that, you have to be really mindful about making sure that your tuning and timing are right, and that we don't have uncomfortable moments in that song that need to be sort of corrected, right?
Mhm.
So you do all that editing, and you have to get all that taken care of before you really get into the mix. Otherwise, you're distracting yourself with the things that need to be cleaned up,
Yeah.
right? And that's I mean, that's just every session. That's just standard practice. I have kind of a workflow. Okay, I open a session, I'm gonna get started. And the first thing I do is I go through all the tracks, I clean all the tracks, I tune, I time, I get everything in order before I actually start, a workflow around, coming to the mix and the balance and putting EQs and compressors and reverbs and delays and things like that on the tracks.
And then I get a mix and I get all excited.
Yeah, and that's an iterative collaborative process as well, right? Because, the first mix that gets sent out is my first interpretation of what I think you want to hear in that mix. But again, you're the artist, right? It's your song. And so I still fully expect that you're going to come back with mix notes, right? And because that's what the way it should be,
Yeah.
right? Is, hey, I wrote this. I'd like this to be heard a little bit more. I'd like this to be heard a little bit less. I'd like this one part to come out, in between these lines. I mean, as an artist, again, you have a vision in your mind. Um, and so getting mix notes and having that iterative process of going back and forth on a mix is very normal, right?
Yeah. Well, I think too, like at the beginning, like I was afraid to send my messages because I was like, oh no, he's gonna see my name pop up and I'm like paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff. But I feel like we've worked together long enough now that you kind of like know what I would want, so there's not as many.
Yeah, there's no doubt. It's always interesting when I start working with an artist for the first time, and I always try to explain this up front that it's a learning process to learn one another, right? To get to know one another musically and artistically, right? I need to understand where the artist is coming from and what their preferences and their likes and their dislikes and their tastes are, right? And they have to learn my work style and my tendencies, even in mixing, right? Like, so, if I have a tendency to mix something up versus down, you'll start to get to know what my tendencies are, and I'll start to know what your preferences are. And over time, what you find is they come together more and more. And so, we're likely to hit the mark a little quicker after we've done a number of songs together than we might the first time we work on something.
Yeah, absolutely. So after we do a couple mixes and I give you the whole, yeah, you can master. What exactly is mastering for everybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, mastering is the sort of final polish that goes on to the song, right? And there's a number of things that are accomplished in the mastering process. The first one, and most simply, is getting the right levels, right? From an industry standard perspective, making sure that it's loud enough to go, on the radio and be, at the same level as the song that preceded or succeeds that song on the radio, right? Is the easiest way to describe it. You want to be at sort of normal listening levels, not too loud, not too soft. Um, so getting it at the right levels, getting the right balance on the EQ, right? So the mixing engineer is focused on all the individual tracks and the balance of all those tracks with one another. The mastering engineer is actually listening to the track as a whole. They're not adjusting individual instrument levels at that point. They're just working on the balance of the total track, both from an EQ, from a level, from a compression perspective, and making sure that that all the files that they're producing are what the artist needs. And what I mean by that is, do we have the right master files for digital distribution? Do we have instrumental files? Do we have what we call the TV versions, which are, no lead vocals, but we have the backing vocals, all the different file formats that you would need for distribution and the end use. All of that stuff happens in the mastering process.
Awesome. Well, there we go. We talked about the whole process from songwriting to mastering. This has been loads of fun. But before we wrap things up, what are some final thoughts you have for the production process as a whole?
Well, I think the final thought that I would have is, while it feels like a very technical and sometimes overwhelming process, uh, you always want to keep in mind that it's art and not science, and what sounds good is good. And you want to have fun in that process, and you want to make sure that you don't get so wrapped up in the technicalities that you aren't feeling the music, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to accomplish, is to convey a feeling, an emotion, a message that should be coming from that music. So we don't want to get so lost in the technicalities that we lose sight of what the real purpose is in communicating an emotion.
Perfect. Love that so much. Well, it was lovely having you on finally. So, this is the part of the episode where I have people plug stuff. So, is there anything you would like to share here?
Uh, yeah, I guess just, plugging the vault. If anybody is interested in recording and getting their music down and releasing music, by all means, give us a call. You can find us at thevaultrecording.com. And would love to hear from folks who might be interested.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this fantastic conversation all about the music production process. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed listening. And of course, until next time,
Stay
stay right
right
on
on
track.
track.